This is Deborah Johnson for Women at Halftime, and I'm passionate about helping women use their untapped skills, resources, and talents to create their ideal work and lifestyle, making a difference in their second half. Well, hello, this is Deborah Johnson with you one more time again today, one more week for the Women at Halftime podcast. It's always a privilege to bring you some messages every single week. To remind you, once a month, my husband and I are on together, Greg and I, and once a month we have a guest, and then I am on at least a couple times. And today is a wonderful message, historical cycle of hope throughout history. And I chose this because I've been talking a little bit about hope and the importance of hope. In our world today, we have a lot of people just facing a lot of fear of getting back to work, of even going out still, and of really a fear of what's happening in world events. So I decided to go ahead and approach this. I've done a little more research for today. Some of you history buffs will enjoy. I'm doing the historical cycles. And why am I doing this? Historical cycles are the ups and downs of history that repeat themselves. And just like those historical cycles of history, a business cycle, it follows the expansion and contraction of economic activities. And the writer and philosopher, George Santayana, let's see if I can say this, Santayana, I think it is, wrote the quote, clear back 1863 to 1952, that's when he lived. But we have heard this through the years. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So I believe this is true in many respects, but I'd like to put a little different twist on the documentation of historical cycles, putting them in 10-year chunks, because every decade has some feeling of hopelessness, but it's always come through with innovation and strength, especially in this country. And that should give most of you hope, and it definitely did for me. And as my new book is out now, The Summit, it's all about pursuing your goals and hope. And we'll start with the 1930s. So hopelessness to innovation in the 1930s. 1930s, it held the Great Depression. Between 1920 and 1932, the average America's income, they dropped 40%. Can you imagine your income dropping 40%? And during this decade, 86,000 businesses failed and 9,000 banks went out of business, with 1/3 of the population unemployed. And many of our grandparents, they lived through this Great Depression, and they continued to live frugally through their whole life. Now, what happened with innovation in the 1930s? Throughout this time, people learned how to save and how to get scrappy. My grandparents raised dairy cows. That's where I was born, on a dairy farm, working extremely hard to eke out a living. They bought land, and as they were able to do that, they built on it. And what they didn't know, they learned. And this work ethic carried them all throughout their whole life. My grandfather even giving back to their small Southern California community by serving as a mayor of his community. Let's move on to the 1940s, this historical cycle of hopelessness to innovation in the 1940s. Well, the 1940s, it held World War II for the U.S. when Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. base in Pearl Harbor. Well, the war didn't end until 1945, when dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japan. The Nazi extermination camps was a Holocaust during this time, killed hundreds of thousands of Jews. And when Germany pummeled Britain with heavy bombing raids in a 1940 to 41 campaign termed the Blitz, men, women, and children, they had to carry their own gas masks at all times because they feared German planes they'd drop gas bombs. We talk about masks today. What about those? And D-Day, it sees 150,000 Allied troops successfully storm the beaches of Normandy, liberating France. So what's the innovation of the 1940s? During this time, the US Congress created several branches of the armed forces, and the United Nations is created after 50 nations signed the charter. Communication progressed with the transistor. The Polaroid instant camera, remember that, some of you, was invented, and 45 RPM records are introduced. Oh, those were all the craze. All right, let's move to the 1950s. All right, we've gone to the 30s, 40s, now 50s. The 1950s brought the Korean War when North Korea invaded South Korea in June of 1950. The Cold War became a grim reality because both the Soviet dominated the East and the capitalists dominated the West. And they both had that power and technology for a nuclear holocaust. The civil rights movement began with the murder of Emmett Till and the refusal of Rosa Parks to give up her seat on the bus to a white man. The Vietnam War began, clear back then, 1954. All right, the innovation of the 1950s. This was fun. The first independent credit card company is created with cardboard cards. Can you imagine? The Diners Club credit card was the first multi-purpose charge card with over 1 million members by 1959. And the first TV remote control was invented, and 8 million homes in the US now owned televisions. Okay, well, I've gone pretty quickly through these, but I'm going to keep going. If you want to review any of this, remember, with every single episode, every single show, I put out an article. So watch for the link so you can go to the article and get some of these facts that I've thrown out. And I could not put everything in here. This was a little bit longer than normal anyway. But I thought it very important to go through what was happening, some of the main happenings, and the positive that happened through every single one of those decades. And that's why I put this whole thing together. It was a very informative episode for me to put together, as well as, gave me hope as I saw the different decades. So let's move on. Historical cycle of hopelessness to innovation in the 1960s. The 1960s was dominated by the Vietnam War, sending 3,500 troops in 1960. The civil rights protests were common, and Martin Luther King Jr. gave his "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963. The 60s also, it brought the assassinations of US President John F. Kennedy in 1963 and Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. The Cuban Missile Crisis had the world on the edge of another world war as the US and USSR, Russia, came close to launching nuclear attacks in 1962. Innovation of the 1960s. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon, and they safely returned to Earth in 1969. Remember that? The computer mouse, heart pacemaker, tape cassette, and portable calculator were all invented in the 1960s. Music became a huge influence on the younger generation to define the lifestyle of rockers and protesters. Let's move on to the 70s. Historical cycle of hopelessness to innovation in the 1970s. The 1970s brought Kent State shootings and the Watergate scandal in 1972 with Nixon's resignation in 1974. Iran took American hostages in Tehran in 1979. The Vietnam War ended in 1975 with 57,939 members of the US Armed Forces dying or missing. The war brought a great deal of controversy, with many of our young men dying. Elvis Presley was also found dead in 1977. Innovation of the 1970s. The first jumbo jet, Boeing 747, makes its debut commercial flight from New York all the way to London. The first microprocessor is released by Intel, and the UPC barcode is introduced. We use that every day now. Bill Gates and Paul Allen invented Microsoft and the Walkman. Remember those? It was introduced by Sony. Let's move on. Historical cycle of hopelessness to innovation in the 1980s. Oh, the 1980s brought the shooting of John Lennon in 1980. And the first cases of AIDS were reported in June of 1981, with more than 700,000 people in the US dying from HIV-related illness. And today there's more than 1.2 million people living with HIV in the US. We don't hear about it too much anymore. Mad cow disease was identified in Britain in 1986. And also in 1986, the spaceship Challenger, it exploded during liftoff in what would have been the 9th mission, and all 7 crew members died. I remember that. Innovation in the 1980s. The 80s signaled the start of the computer age. Post-it notes were created, and popular TV shows that included Cheers, The Golden Girls, Miami Vice, and The Simpsons. Many South American countries returned to democracy after a period of dictatorships that just didn't work. Ronald Reagan's presidency brought humor and star quality as an actor to the office. Historical cycle of hopelessness to innovation in the 1990s. The 1990s genocide and civil war take place in Rwanda, with an estimated 500,000 or more people killed. The Persian Gulf War began with a massive US-led air offensive known as Operation Desert Storm, with 42 days of relentless attacks on Iraq. I remember that so well. The Bosnian War in Yugoslavia happened between 1992 and 1995. Central American countries are devastated by Hurricane Mitch. And the World Trade Organization, the WTO, is created in 1995. That could have been part of the innovation of the 1990s, because there was growth of the World Wide Web and the personal computer, with an estimated 295 million users at this point. Cloning and stem cell research left moral and political questions for the future. And also the development of genetic engineering. Owning a mobile phone was now a part of everyday life. Remember those first mobile phones? My first mobile phone, I remember well. My father actually got it for me for one of my birthdays. My birthday is close to Christmas. And he was concerned because I was doing a lot of club work, working very late at night to the early mornings. And I was so excited. But that phone was large and it got really hot. As you know, there was no Bluetooth at that point, and it got really hot as you held it. So you tried to, speak for short periods of time. But it was such an innovation to be able to use that portable cell phone and not have to have those big antennas out of our car. So there is innovation every single period of time, every single decade. There's innovation that happens, and that was one that happened during that time of our country, which is the 1990s. Historical cycle of hopelessness to innovation in the 2000s. Remember this one. The 2000s brought the fear for the end of mankind with Y2K at the beginning of 2000. 9/11 terrorist attacks happened to leave nearly 3,000 people dead, bringing down the Twin Towers in New York. The US evaded Iraq. Michael Jackson died. Wow. The financial crisis of 2008 and 9 brought the Great Recession, with property prices falling and the collapse of banks. What a tough decade. But innovation of the 2000s. There was no end of mankind with the Y2K. In fact, I was playing a New Year's Eve gig party at Knott's Berry Farm with a band. I had brought in a band, and people kept dancing all through midnight. iTunes was released by Apple in the 2000s. Tiger Woods becomes the youngest player to win a Grand Slam in golf. I like this one. The do not call list is started, and Facebook is launched in 2004, and YouTube becomes a part of Google. Historical cycle of hopelessness to innovation in the 2010s. The 2010s financial crisis and high unemployment, it continues. 1,000 people marched through New York financial district with an Occupy Wall Street banner. Arizona Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords was shot with 12 others. There was an attack on Sandy Hook Elementary School, among others. What about Hurricane Sandy, the Boston Marathon bombings, and the shutdown of the US government? This is when Black Lives Matter started in 2013 with the acquittal of George Zimmerman. Innovation in the 2010s, and there were some of them. Osama bin Laden was found and killed by US Navy SEALs. And Marvels and the Avengers premieres in Hollywood. A businessman and a TV personality, Donald Trump won the presidency of the US with the slogan and mantra, "Make America Great Again." And it showed how important branding was. The Chicago Cubs won the World Series, first time in 108 years. One of our sons was so excited about that, and we were too. Now let's get to the 2020s, historical cycle of hopelessness. Here we are in the 2020s. It brought in a worldwide pandemic, as we know. It brought in isolation, fear, and sequestration. It also ushered in political influence on health issues and freedoms. Social media platforms became political platforms. We know that. Instituting bans on any content unfavorable with the mainstream, what the messaging was. And the war of the 2020s has now become a psychological war, a war of mindsets and of fighting back for our freedoms. But here are the innovations. Touchless everything, including credit cards, facial recognition in airports, and body temperature screening. It was implemented, how can I say that? And the progression of artificial intelligence, it continues to happen with a shortage of low-wage workers. And a vaccine for COVID-19 was produced in record time under the Trump presidency. Now, I want to stop here for just a moment on a couple of these things, because the amount of innovation that's happened in 2021, which is, as I am releasing this podcast and this show, I am looking at all of the innovation that has occurred. And from I was just overseas internationally, and all I had to do was take my credit card and just wave it over the reader, even over in Switzerland and in France and everywhere. They've got this touchless everything now. Going through the airport, they do a facial recognition, and you have to show, of course, your passport and everything. But it's kind of scary, some of that facial recognition, but used in the right way, it's good. But they're able to, and also scanning, of course, with TSA. We've been there for quite a while. But body temperature screening, and we knew how this was, especially at the beginning of COVID, when they were trying to just screen as many people as possible coming into an area. And the development of a vaccine, we've never had a vaccine this quick. No matter how you feel about the vaccine, I think that should be everyone's personal choice. And in fact, there are laws in place, the HIPAA laws and all of that in our country, that state those freedoms and that privacy law. And we need to hang on to many of those. And I don't share my pro or con views on any of that. I just think everyone should have that freedom. And but protect your own health. But the vaccine at least was made available, and it helped so many at least get over the fear of going out. And I think that's a major thing as well. Fear is a major hindrance to a lot of people even living life to the fullest, especially at the halftime of life. I don't want to live the rest of my life in fear. I want to be able to enjoy these years that I have. And losing both parents really made that message strong in my life. So how do I wrap all of this up with the causes of innovation? Well, innovation happens when there's an immediate need to be filled. And the most recent example is AI, the artificial intelligence. The US labor crunch, it escalated the innovation of all of that touchless technology because of the viral spread of COVID-19. And also, because the vaccine was produced in record time, we have so much more freedom in getting on with our lives. And our vaccine, we've never had one as fast and efficiently, that's the hard word to say too, efficiently. The pharmaceutical companies, they have been researching for several years. We have to realize that. And it provided the groundwork for producing that vaccine. Well, the book, The Summit, the book that I just released, and you'll see this everywhere on my websites, but it addresses that fear and hopelessness many are feeling in our world today. And every decade has had its challenges, but most have had that great innovation come out of those challenges. And the timing of this book that's focused on hope and purpose, it couldn't have been better. And I really want to leave that message with you today, that as we look around us, every generation thinks, this has to be the end. Our whole world is going to blow up or something's going to happen. This has to be end times, however you believe. And you see that there's positiveness, everything that comes out. People learn how to fight. They learn what's important in their lives. And something my dad said to me before he passed, and I had those brief 11 weeks after we found he was ill, he said, "I'm not afraid of dying. I know where I'm going, but I really like living." And I want to leave that with you today, to really, really like living and to work toward innovation in your life, in your business, whatever you decide to do at this point in your life. I help people at mid-career or at the halftime of life be able to get on with their lives and to be able to, I've been a lifetime entrepreneur. I know what it takes to put all those pieces together and also to use technology to be able to help out, but with the messaging and everything else. But I want you to enjoy this part of your life, this time of your life, whether you want to start volunteering more as well. That's a big part of people's lives, and to be able to give back. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Every single week we come out with a different episode. Next week we have a surprise guest. Once a month I bring in a guest, and once a month Greg and I are on together, and then I have a couple messages every month as well. womenatalhalftime.com. You can connect with me there. Please share this. It's the best way to get the word out about podcasts. And I don't do a lot of advertising. I don't take on sponsors. I'm very self-supported. So you're being able to share this with others. Make sure, especially on episodes like this, where there's so much information that I have shared, make sure that you go to the article. And you can always find that on goalsforyourlife.com/blog. All of my articles are on that. Or you can just go directly to womenatalhalftime.com, and the links will be there as well. Thank you so much again for joining me. It's always a pleasure. And I will look forward to being with you next time. Bye for now.
Thank you for joining us on Women at Halftime. Visit goalsforyourlife.com or womenatalhalftime.com for many more resources, downloads, and programs, or to get in touch with me. I'd love it if you leave me a review and tell your friends. So until next time, this is Deborah Johnson, signing off.